I'm assuming everyone else is with us in spirit.
Sure.
Or could be. But, yeah, so he wrote this to help explain the conflict a lot of guys... And I've discovered this myself. One of my favorites, unfortunately, he died really quite a few years ago. He was in his late 90s, though. But he was a Methodist initially, way back in the 40s. And then and became even a professor at Ohio Wesleyan University, where he was also the chaplain. And then he was hired to come out to Alaska Methodist University when it first started, which is now APU, Alaska Pacific University. But it was Alaska Methodist initially. Dr. Richard Gay, his name was, G-A-Y, and Averill. And they came out with some of their young kids and everything, and the buildings were still just mud holes, where they had dug foundations and stuff, and they moved out, and he became a philosophy professor and theology and the vice president of the college, until the Methodists basically had realized they overbuilt in a lot of these universities. They couldn't afford them anymore, and so they pulled out, and that was the end of his academic career at that point, because he didn't move back anywhere. He stayed here, and he and his wife bought a cabin down in Hope, around the other.
Yeah.
And but he ended up not being a Methodist. I mean, he was still a Methodist minister officially, but he himself had educated himself away from that sectarian dogma. And so he became the Unitarian minister in town, and was that for at least a few years. I don't remember how many. And that's how I knew him, because he was still, even though he was retired, he was doing maybe 4 or more sermons a year, and they were absolutely fantastic. And he was just, an amazing person to listen to. So brilliant, so educated, and so open-minded and everything. So he was an example of one of the ministers that migrated from one church to another to go along with his change in beliefs, right?
Just a dock, so I can hear footsteps out there.
Yeah,
I wonder if you should put a sign up that says we're not in that one, we're in this one.
Yeah, we're over here. Over here. It sounds like 3PO, doesn't it? Over here.
Oh, yeah.
Transport. People walking. Are you looking for the philosophy class?
No.
Okay. I'm going home. Oh, okay. However, so that's an interesting book. I have it at home.
In the
I mean, but you can imagine what it would be like, for folks stuck like that. Of course, Daniel Dennett is pretty interesting himself. He's one of the so-called 4 horsemen that have been trying to de-religify, the Western civilization ever since September 11th, 2001, because their attitude is the reason that radical organizations that do violent things to civilization are even acceptable in some circles is because people who are religious, even though they're more moderate, exist. So if you have all these religious organizations, even though they're pretty close to atheism in some respects, it allows fundamentalists to think that they're acceptable too. So the idea of Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris, those are the four. Their idea was, let's embarrass the heck out of people who believe in religion. But then,
how's that working out?
No, that didn't. It didn't work out. But they certainly caught their own audience. They became very popular with a certain niche group of folks who were really pretty radical, actually. Because they want to be critical of anyone that says they believe in God, even when you're talking about such an abstract definition that basically logically it seems necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, what we were talking about with Anselm,
I think what we called that, growing up, the term for that was the militant atheist, or the atheist militant.
They just want to embarrass everybody
Right.
by talking about the flying spaghetti monster.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of cute. I used it as my Facebook icon for a while, just because it was so cute. But so ontology is the study of what there is, and so basically your definition of things, right? And as a result, when you have the definition as Anselm basically gave it for the concept of God, as that than which nothing greater can be thought, that definition seems to require that God exists. Because if God doesn't exist, then God is not that than which nothing greater can be thought. But the definition accepted is God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. And something has to be that. That's like, at least the universe. If the universe is all there is, well, that's quite a lot, actually. But if that's what there is, and there's nothing even greater in some way than the universe, then the universe is God, by definition. So God exists by that definition.
Right.
So the trouble is, okay, so once you've proved that God exists, all sorts of folks then begin thinking, well, so Jesus is God. And you think, whoa. We didn't say anything else about any other characteristics. So it's very frustrating that
more
way.
Abstract than
Yeah. You're basically stuck with that. In fact, I've mentioned that years ago we had a professor from Yale religion department give a lecture here at the Consortium Library. It was very, very crowded, about 300 people. And that room doesn't fit 300 people. But his topic was that atheism and theism are almost identical. So, you're actually better off saying you're a theist and believing in God than saying you're an atheist. And the argument was, well, a contemporary theist's definition of God is that than which nothing greater could be thought, and there's nothing else you could say. Right? And so in a sense, an atheist is more radical because an atheist wants to prove something doesn't exist, which even back in the Middle Ages, theologians point out, that you can't prove that something doesn't exist, right? I think Aristotle probably would have even said that, although I'm not sure that Aristotle did say that, but that follows from Aristotle's logic, really. So you end up with, being an atheist is actually kind of a dumb move. Where you could be an agnostic, that's okay. Maybe that's the smartest thing, really. Um, but the thing is, you don't want to take yourself out of the argument, because the real argument then becomes, okay, so what is the kind of highest values that we think ought to be the characteristics of God? And if you say there is no God, you are not part of the argument, so basically your values are not something anyone else is interested in hearing about. So if you want to be part of the really most important argument there is, you have to be a member of the argument and say, yes, okay, I agree, there's a God, what would it be? So that you can have your say too.
Right.
That's like saying, I don't like the president, but I'm not going to vote. That's, okay. Maybe you might want to say that my vote won't make any difference.
But gosh darn it, I'm going to play the game regardless.
And yeah, at least you'll feel better. Granted, say, in Alaska, by the time we vote, the election's over.
Yeah.
Because we're last ones to close our polling station. And by the way, our 3 electoral votes don't change anything.
Yeah.
It won't push anyone over the top. By the time they do Pennsylvania and Ohio, the election's done, basically.
It'd be a fun election, though. Imagine if they're waiting on Alaska. And Alaska goes, wait a minute.
What?
You want us? You want our opinion? Oh. All right.
However, it does make you feel like you're participating. You're involved. So that's the same kind of thing. Feel involved, voice your opinion, and in order to do that, you at least have to say that there has to be something. Maybe it's just an algorithm in space, and space wouldn't even be there actually, as Augustine points out, and we talked about that last week. That in his Confessions, what existed before God created everything? There was no time. There was no then. Because God created everything. Mm-hmm. And you get also his analysis of, like Genesis, because, if you're accepting Scripture as the Word of God, you've got some very convoluted stuff in there, obviously, right? Let's face it, today we would say this is primitive literature, people trying to express what it was. But Augustine had to accept that as that was right. Okay. And let's face it,
there was no denying Genesis in Augustine's time.
Right. And of course the thing is, it's a matter of interpreting what you want it to mean, right? And Augustine did a lot of that, and beautifully, because that became Christian dogma. Mm-hmm. Right? And what he points out is, when it says that God created the heavens and the earth, you're also thinking that God existed in heaven prior to the creation. So that's confusing, because he can't be creating heaven if heaven already existed. So Augustine's solution is, so the heaven that God existed in is a separate heaven than the physical heaven that God creates with the earth. And that physical heaven, by the way, are the spheres where the planets and the stars are, right? So that's a physical heaven, the heavens, right? So that's different. So Augustine does a great job setting things up that way for 1,000 years, more than that, because what I was going to talk about today is when we get to Aquinas, and even before you get to Aquinas, oh, good. I guess that's none of these pictures. I don't know if they have any inkling of what he actually looked like. really, you know. But
What's the name of that haircut? Shoot.
the hair god?
The haircut. The
Tonsure. That's a tonsure.
tonsure, that's what it
Where
is.
they
What a weird... Middle Ages had such a weird number of traditions and things they thought were holy.
yeah,
or
the
church
other night, when I had talked very briefly about Hildegard of Bingen, who was a Saint Hildegard of Bingen. She was an abbess that ran the convent of Bingen, but she started off as a young girl and everything. But I mentioned her as an exemplar of the medieval life, right? And there's a new movie about her, and I have often in class shown the trailer for the movie, but I thought, hey, this time I've discovered that the full movie was on YouTube. So I thought, oh, I get to watch it. So the other night I watched it. Aber es ist nur auf Deutsch. So if you don't speak German,
No subtitles?
there was no subtitles on that, whoever uploaded it. But I was able to follow most of it, enough of it that it was fine. I'm clearly not fluent, and they spoke pretty quickly in a couple places, but I got the gist of what was going on. And so I watched it, and there was some really horrible aspects to that life back then. When she was first brought into the convent as a young girl, they bricked her into a cell, basically, and she stayed there. It was just like a little window. And they did have that in the movie, that she had this little window where she could see the monks chanting in the church. But that's the window that they handed her food, her and her cellmate. And they were in there until they were older. Let out. It was just awful. And there were some other awful things, traditions. Because their whole attitude, based on Augustine, is that the physical body is corrupt and our soul is the important part of us. And so what we want to do is free the soul from the temptations that come with being a body, right? And so people would whip themselves. They used a thing called a cilice, which, did you ever see the movie The Da Vinci Code? The leg thing, yeah. Well, there was one scene in the movie where one of their fellow nuns in the convent died, and as a result, they had a last rites and everything, and then a couple of the nuns, including Hildegard, were taking her, to prepare her for burial. And as they undressed her, they realized she had one on across her chest that just absolutely tore her up. And so she was in agony for basically her whole life, because she was wearing this thing that, as they, undressed her, no one had known, I guess. And, as they take her, to prepare her for burial, they see this and they realize, oh my, I would imagine they would have even barfed, in horror at what. But the goal was to free your soul from attachment to the earth.
Right. So, not to get too far off topic, but what are your thoughts just on Christendom in the Middle Ages, and why it seems like when Christendom started, there were rules, but it was more like love your neighbor kind of feeling, and then we didn't get a lot back to that until, I'd say, the last 100 years. But especially in that Middle Ages, Christendom got really dark and really weird, and things got really weird in the Middle Ages. What is your initial thought?
Well, for one thing, it's much more complex than there's like Hildegard, for example. is held up as an example of a more enlightened person who was okay with enjoying life. In fact, one of the things she was famous for was her music, and they showed that in the movie too, and so on. And a lot of the monasteries had a lot of wealth, and so it was actually a wonderful place. But the orders typically were rebellious